Welcome to the last session, New Start for the Family. And today we're going to be discovering that all 8 are essential, but especially the final one. The T stands for what? Trust in God. And really, New Start is all about being happy and being healthy. And so it's mystifying to me why people wouldn't want to participate in really all of the New Start principles, including this one, because the evidence is very clear that it leads to both of those states. New Start is also about longevity. And one of the questions that's been asked is, how long can human beings today live on this earth? The longest living person has been 122 years recently, And so the human lifespan, we know, can be 120 years. And this question was asked by a very famous group from the National Geographic a few years ago. And they asked that question. They looked around the world for the longest living people, and they found 3 groups that have the highest percentage of those that live past 100 years of age. And the Sardinians were one. The Okinawans were second, and that's what's pictured there. And Seventh-day Adventists were the 3rd group that lived the longest. Then they took a look at those 3 groups to see what was similar about them. Do they share any common health habits that could help individuals live a long life? And they found a number of them that were the same. All 3 groups were active. They were physically active in general. Most of them exercised on a regular basis. All 3 groups ate lots of fruits and vegetables. So that was characteristic of the 3. All 3 groups limited the amount of meat that they ate. Some didn't eat any meat at all. They also limited the amount of processed foods that they ate, and some ate 0 processed foods. All groups drank plenty of water, so water was part of it. They all did not smoke. And then there were some additional ones. They tended not to overeat. In fact, the groups in general stated, according to National Geographic, that they had a tendency to push the plate away when 80% full. And that's probably a pretty good rule to follow. They limited their alcohol intake. None of them had high alcohol intakes at all. Some limited amounts, some 0 alcohol. They all 3 groups had an active social network that gave a sense of belonging. In addition, they all pursued a spiritual path. And so spirituality was there among all 3 groups. And then finally, the 10th factor, all 3 groups had a sense of purpose in life. So there was some meaning and purpose that was there. Now, one researcher, actually it was the researcher that did the study, but then a few others were asking about, was there, which group out of those 3 actually did the best as far as longevity is concerned. And they found out there was only one of those 3 groups that not only had the highest longevity, but their longevity is continuing to improve. The other 2 groups, their longevity has been high, but over the course of time, it's actually going down a little bit, meaning that their healthy lifestyle practices are starting to merge away a little bit and not to continue and go forward. Which group had the highest longevity and continued to improve it? It was the Seventh-day Adventist group. And it's now known as the longest living group of people in the world as a result. And the question is, what other attributes may be contributing to this advantage? Well, there are higher rates of vegetarians in that group than in the other groups, so that certainly would have an advantage. No tobacco, no alcohol. They were part of the group that was really most of them, vast majority of them, zero alcohol. But they also discourage caffeine usage and other addictions as well. They believe in salvation by faith. There's evidence that faith is very much a health-giving component. And Seventh-day Adventists do believe in salvation by faith. They also believe in a faith that helps in overcoming and developing positive attributes of love, joy, peace, and patience. So it's not just a faith about something that's going to happen in the distant future. It's a faith that can actually positively affect them now and help them with their everyday life. In addition to that, one researcher, not the National Geographic researcher, but one of the researchers, and this was published in the Chicago Tribune a few years ago, says that how religion's belief in death has a vital role to play in how healthy they are. For instance, Seventh-day Adventists believe that death is a deep, unconscious sleep awaiting the resurrection. And when you believe that when you die, you're actually going to die, in other words, be dead, at least for a while, you become very pro-life. And you, as a result, are more willing to incorporate healthy lifestyle principles. Other religions that believe that as soon as you die, you are not going to ever be in an unconscious state. You will just have another sphere of existence that might be better. I remember one group of religious people, I was talking to them about health, and they said, well, when we see those golden arches, we know we're on our way to the pearly gates. So there's not really much motivation, in regards to that aspects of things. So actual teachings. And, of course, Christ himself taught, one of the reasons Adventists believe that Christ himself taught that death was indeed that, an unconscious sleep. And then the other factor that was brought out by the National Geographic article was that the Seventh-day Adventists, as their name implies, keep the seventh-day Sabbath. And we talked about that weekly rest being a vital part of improved health. Well, studies have been now published in multitudes of peer-reviewed journals showing that faith in God favors good health. Religious attendance and private devotion strengthen a person's religious belief, and strong religious belief, in turn, when accompanied by a high level of religious certainty, have a substantial positive influence on well-being. And so we really can't ignore that. We can't ignore the T part of New Start as much as some might want to ignore it. This study was done recently on the advantages of church attendance. And it looked at not just Christians, it looked at Muslims, it looked at Jews, and attendance at religious services, synagogues, mosques, churches. And it found that there was mounting evidence that people who regularly attend religious services are healthier than those who don't. And at the study's outset, 65% of the female participants and 51% of the male participants reported attending religious services regularly. They were then compared, these were both healthy groups, with healthy individuals who didn't, and they looked at their lung function. The study was 4.6 years, and this was the pulmonary expiratory flow rate. In other words, taking a look at lung capacity, and they found just by attending church, their lung capacity declined, or I should say by not attending church, their lung capacity declined twice as much in the people who didn't attend church services regularly compared to those who did. So in other words, your lung function, which tends to decrease about 1% per year per individual, their lung function actually was aging at only half the rate of those who did not attend church. And of course, many people are asking the question, what can church do for you? Well, there's several things. There's a social support. There's others that go to church. And it is a social support network. It aids in achieving your God-given purpose or plan for your life. And I think that's very important. Those who do live a long time believe in a faith in God where God has a plan for their life. It promotes the healthy lifestyle God desires you to live. And really, any church that doesn't support health at all, it makes you wonder if it's really a positive church experience because in general, health and religion do go together. It improves coping skills through prayer meetings and small group studies. It's a very meaningful way to connect with friends. And it also helps you feel part of a grand purpose even above your individual endeavors. And so these things have all been demonstrated in the medical literature when you look at these studies as certain aspects of what church can do for you and why it can be healthy. But I think it goes beyond that. And that is when you have an active faith and you know that God has a plan for your life and you believe He's influencing you now and you take part in that, it can actually help you in the process of making and staying with positive lifestyle choices. In other words, it can even help you in overcoming addictive habits that are almost impossible to overcome. I know, of course, many know me for my work in depression recovery, and we know that addictions sometimes are very much related to depression. Probably half of the people that come to our depression recovery programs that are treatment resistant have some sort of addiction that is impairing them significantly. And I know when I was spending time with a number of psychiatrists, including secular agnostic psychiatrists, I was spending some time with one learning some mind principles. And there was a man that came to him that had a terrible addiction and did not know how to get rid of it, and he had tried everything. And he says, "Doctor, is there any new pill? Is there a new pill? There's got to be something. I want to get rid of this in the worst way. Is there any way that you can give me anything that's going to help me?" And he said, "Sir, there isn't anything I can give you to help you overcome this addiction." And he says, "I'll be honest with you," he says, "I'm not a believer in God. But I do know this, the people that have been able to overcome addictions like yours, they all hooked up with a religion." And he said, "I would recommend that you hook up with those spiritual people. I don't know what they do, but I do know that if you're going to overcome it, that's the way it's going to happen." And that's why we need to recognize that, first of all, we first need to recognize that our habit is destructive to want to overcome. He recognized it was destructive. We then need to choose to overcome, and that's an important aspect. But in order to overcome, when it's a painful heart addiction, you need to rely on spiritual resources. And that's why even the 12-step program, the success it has, is really related to this phrase, let go and let God. Meaning that we can, in our own power, when the grip of addiction, be able to overcome. We have to rely on a power outside of us for this to occur. There was a study that was done by Dr. DeRose and others at the Lifestyle Center of America showing that when it comes to addictions, we actually do better by giving up all the addictions at the same time. For instance, those who give up caffeine and tobacco, they're 5 times less likely to go back to smoking than those who just give up tobacco alone. And so many addiction centers are learning that the process is let's get clean all at once, and let's just not trade one addiction for another or have an addiction on board that's going to lead us into another step. Let's get rid of all those addictions at the same time. And of course, that also requires spiritual resources. There are 4 stages of change. We've mentioned them once briefly in a previous session. The first stage is unconsciously incompetent. That's when you are living in an unhealthy way, but you don't recognize it. In other words, at times you might even be happy. But you know, ignorance is bliss, but it's only blissful for so long. Eventually the effects of the ignorance start catching up with you and you start having your life change in very adverse ways. So you need to move further. You have to then become consciously incompetent. What moves you from unconscious incompetence to conscious incompetence? It's knowledge, good and accurate knowledge, or we might call it truth. When you recognize something is true, and your life isn't lining up, you are now consciously incompetent. And that's what can happen as a result of coming to a New Start series such as this. But we hope you don't stay there. We hope you go into stage 3, which is the change way. That is where you become consciously competent. And if you stay in stage 3 long enough, you eventually go into stage 4, where it's no longer a struggle, it's no longer conscious, you're unconsciously competent. And that, of course, is a stage of great joy. I've met a lot of people that go back and forth between stage 2 and 3, however, and never really get to stage 4. There are 2 barriers to reaching the final stage of change. One of those barriers is mentioned in the Bible, and if we overcome this part, we'll be able to eventually go to stage 4 instead of staying in stage 3 and going back to stage 2. Paul said, "Make no provision for the flesh to fulfill its lusts." Now, I can best illustrate this by Johnny. Johnny was going out to school, and his mother said, "Johnny, I want you to come straight home from school today. I don't want you to go swimming after school." So Johnny gathers up his stuff, goes out to school. He comes home late, and his hair is all wet. And his mother says, "Johnny, I told you not to go swimming after school today. What happened?" He says, "Mom, I was tempted." She says, "If I told you not to go swimming after school today, why did you still go and take your bathing suit with you as you left?" And he says, "Because I thought I might be tempted." And many individuals, when they're going through this process of change, they actually make provision. That's what we call making provision. And thus they continue to struggle and think that they're never going to be able to overcome that struggle. The second aspect is the Bible that says, "He who endures to the end will be saved." No matter what the addiction is, if we stay in stage 3 long enough, we'll eventually get to stage 4, where it's no longer a struggle, it's no longer a constant battle, and we're benefiting from it. Now, if we happen to go back into stage 2, it doesn't mean we have to give up. One of my favorite authors says, "If you have made mistakes, you certainly gain a victory if you see these mistakes and regard them as what? Beacons of warning. Thus you can turn defeat into victory." In other words, instead of throwing in the towel and saying, "I can't do this," analyze what went wrong. Analyze what steps you went through that you crossed, and then put those up as beacons of warning, and you'll be far less likely to go that way again, so you can go back into stage 3 and stay there. The Bible talks about an 8-stage process for change. Peter learned it, and he obviously wasn't at the top of the pinnacle earlier in his career, very clear. But the first step, he says, is faith. Now, the Bible says this: "To every man is given a measure of faith." What does that mean? Every human being has a frontal lobe. That's the faith part of the brain. And some people that are secular or agnostic or whatever, they might say, "Well, you know, I'm not a spiritual person." But if you worship, you have a frontal lobe. The difference might be who you're worshiping or what you're worshiping. But human beings by nature worship. So that means they have a frontal lobe. So every person is given that measure of faith. The second stage is virtue. That means a willingness to do what's right. A willingness to change for the better. If you have a frontal lobe and a willingness to change for the better, you're on the pathway. You're already at stage 2. Stage 3 then is knowledge. Once you have the willingness, if you're presented with truth, you then go to stage 3. When you incorporate that knowledge, the Bible calls it temperance. And that's when you would be consciously competent. And if you stay conscious competent, you then have endurance or patience. That's stage 5, to stay in stage 3 long enough. Don't go back to stage 2. Keep it going. And then once you have that endurance, you then get to what many think is the pinnacle, but it's not really the pinnacle. The next stage is godliness. That's where it's unconscious competence. It's no longer a struggle in regards to doing what's right. But then once you're at that stage, you then have 2 more to go. Brotherly kindness, in other words, sharing your life and testimony with others and your knowledge with those that are closest to you. And then it advances to what is called agape love. And that's a self-sacrificing love to even people you don't even know. That is the pinnacle of change. And as you get on the New Start program, you can actually reach that love that everyone else is seeking for. Once you reach that final stage, the Bible says, I delight to do thy will, O my God. Yea, thy law is within my heart. In other words, it's a natural outpouring. Thou wilt show me the path of life. In thy presence is fullness of joy. At thy right hand are pleasures forevermore. It's a pleasurable state of existence to be in. And yes, the process might involve some weeping. Weeping may endure for a night, but joy cometh in the morning. Studies have been done in the secular world on how to help others to change permanently. And the most powerful change agent that you can give to others to help them change permanently is actually empathy, where you have a sympathetic love for them, and you're not just telling them things to be arbitrary or to cut at them, but you're actually doing what you can to help them live a better way of life. The secular world calls it altruism. There have been a number of studies on altruism. That means where you're doing something for the good of others with no hope or thought of getting any return yourself. And those who do 7 altruistic acts per week and on a random basis, they actually have a healthier life. You would think they have a less healthier life because they're sacrificing themselves for someone else. But in reality, they live a much healthier life. It's the pinnacle of a positive change. Individuals with strong religious faith do report in scientific, this is well found in scientific journals, higher levels of life satisfaction, greater personal happiness, fewer negative consequences of traumatic life events. That's important. In other words, they can cope more adequately with stress. And I always, when we're talking about stress, I like to look at examples of stress control. Individuals that suffered severe stress but were able to cope with it. And we can learn from individuals like this. One of those examples comes from the Bible himself. 5 times received I 40 stripes, save one. 40 stripes to the cat of 9 tails would kill someone. 39 was supposed to be just a sliver away from death. 5 times he got this to his back. 3 times he was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. 3 times suffered shipwreck. A night and a day have I been in the deep, in journeyings often, in perils of waters, perils of robbers, perils by my own countrymen, perils by the heathen, perils in the city, perils in the wilderness, perils in the sea, and perils among also false brethren, which also got to him, in weariness and painfulness, and watchings often, and hunger and thirst, and fastings often, in cold and nakedness. Who was this? The Apostle Paul. And you know, when I have people coming in front of me telling me about all the stress they're under, and I compare them with this statement, I realize that the average person growing up in the world today is as soft as butter. Very few of them have suffered even maybe 2 or 3 of these things, much less all of those things. And so we do have problems with stress coping mechanisms. How was Paul able to do this? Here's what he said. We are troubled on every side, yet what? Not distressed. We are perplexed, but not in despair. We are persecuted, but not forsaken. We are cast down, but not destroyed. In fact, he went on to say this, nay, in all these things we are more than conquerors through him that loved us. Paul believed in a God that loved him personally and intimately and cared for him. And he had a relationship, an ongoing, day-by-day, moment-by-moment basis, and was able to withstand significant severe stress that would have broken 95% of others. Well, before I close this aspect of the New Start program, we still have the one spiritual aspect to follow by Mark Finley. I'm reminded over many years ago now it's been since the World Trade Center attack occurred. And of course that was a tremendous stressful event. And when it occurred, there were television shows that were canceled night after night. You know, those evening, I know the David Letterman show, many of the other shows were canceled. Even the sports world. They canceled all the NFL games. They canceled all of the baseball games. Baseball was going on. The NFL was going on at that time. And one of the talk show hosts that canceled it, when he came back on some days later, he said, "What I do is so trivial." He recognized in the face of that it was so trivial. Talk show guests, movie stars, were actually refusing to appear at first because they said what they do is so trivial. The sports world admitted that the games they play are so trivial. And my question is this: if they admit it, why do we continue to waste our time with the trivial? It's time for the important things in life. And one of the most important things in life, if not the most important, is that final T. Instead of spending our time with screen time and being entertained by these individuals who recognize the triviality of what they do, let's get involved in something serious that will actually enhance our life, make us happier, and make us far more successful. It is indeed time for the important things in life. When I see a patient, I often just see the tip of the iceberg. That tip of the iceberg is their health and happiness status. How do I find that out? I do a physical exam, I do blood work, I'll have them take depression and anxiety tests, etc., and I'll be able to give them those results. But their health and happiness, I find, is directly related to their everyday habits. But those everyday habits are related to something else. In most people, it's just simply a result of the culture that they grew up in. If they grew up eating meat and potatoes and their parents smoked and drank, chances are they smoke and drink and they eat meat and potatoes. But I recognize there's something deeper than that, and that is their choices and values. Some people grow up eating meat and potatoes who don't eat it anymore. Some people grew up in alcoholic families and they're not drinkers and they're not smokers. What's the difference? They have superseded their culture with choices and values, and underneath that, the very depth of the iceberg, when we go deep, is the overall meaning and purpose in life. That's what the final T can do for you. A meaning and purpose to affect your choices and values, to even affect your culture and your habits, and then we'll see a far different tip of the iceberg. When we speak of God, the Bible says God is truth and God is love. Every individual, in their deepest longing, they desire to love and be loved. And they also desire truth. No one likes a train of lies. Let's embrace the truth of New Start. Let's embrace the love of God and have both of those exhibit in our life. Yes, trust in God. You're much more likely to change for the better and to stay changed for the better if you do so. You're much more likely to have a happy, positive spirit. You're much more likely to be able to handle severe stress and cope in healthier ways to adversity. And finally, you're much more likely to help and foster a love of truth and an empathy for others. So my question to you, why not go for the whole thing? The whole New Start. Why not embrace the New Start lifestyle? If so, get ready for a happier life. Get ready to feel better than you do now. In fact, get ready to experience what great health actually feels like. Get ready to be more helpful to others. And my question would be, what is getting in the way of you embracing this lifestyle if you're not going to embrace certain aspects of the whole thing? What might be getting in the way of that? And is it worth it? In my opinion, nothing is worth sacrificing truth and love to others and love to God over anything. And I think if we put those little things that are barriers in the way of New Start, we will be able to encompass the whole thing. It's time for a new start. Thank you.